Good evening. This is Real Talk, History as a Weapon for Black Liberation, and I'm your host, Dr. Sundiata Kaita Chajua. And today I have a special guest, Bill Fletcher Jr. Bill has been an activist since his teen years. Upon graduating from college, he went on to work as a welder in a shipyard, thereby entering the labor movement. Over the years, he has been active in workplace and community struggles, as well as electoral campaigns. He has worked for several labor unions in addition to serving as the senior staff person of the National AFL-CIO. Fletcher is the former president of Trans-Africa Forum, a senior scholar with the Institute for Policy Studies, and in the leadership of several other projects, including the Black Radical Congress. Fletcher is the co-author, along with Peter Agard, of The Indispensable Ally, Black Workers and the Formation of the Congress of Industrial Organizations, 1934 to 1941. He is the co-author with Dr. Fernando Gaspian of Solidarity Divided, The Crisis in Organized Labor, and the New Path Towards Social Justice, and the author of They're Bankrupting Us and 20 Other Myths About Unions. Fletcher is a syndicated columnist and a regular media commentator on television, radio, and the web. Bill, it is a pleasure to welcome you to Real Talk.
Glad to be
We've
on
been
board.
on before, man.
It's good to be back.
Yeah, way back in, I think, March of 2021 when we first got started.
Yeah, that sounds right.
Go ahead.
No, that sounds right.
Yeah. So you kind of know the format. So one of the things that we try and do is be informal, want a conversation, but I want to give you space to make comprehensive answers, but I do want to encourage you to be as succinct as you can be. Okay? And I know
Sounds
that's
like
a
a plan.
contradiction, but that's
No,
what we
no,
do, right? We side
I'm with you. I'm with you 100%.
Okay, great. So, you know, I'm a devotee of Bill Cross.
Mhm.
And so I do want to get into some personal background. And you're well known, but I still want to dig into some biographical information in terms of how you became a revolutionary.
Mm.
And a revolutionary with a particular emphasis on the labor movement. Okay. So I do want us to take a moment because Bill Cross died on December 6th. And he had come to visit my wife Helen and I. And while here, he contracted a urinary staph infection. And we took him to the hospital, right? Then when he went back to Denver, it got worse. He was ultimately put in a home, and he made the decision that rather after they discovered cancer, that rather than go through the treatment at his age, 84, he made the decision to refuse all food and water and to let himself transition. I love Bill. Love.
Yeah.
So I want us to take a moment of silence. Okay, so Bill, can you unpack your journey? Um, where were you born? Where did you spend your formative years? What's your family's class background? And because we know revolutionaries are made, not born, be specific with the audience about how you became Bill Fletcher Jr. that we see before us that's been involved in liberatory movements since you were A teen, actually a very young teenager, about 14, right?
Correct.
Okay. That's not the path
So
for today.
no, it's interesting, Sundiata. So I grew up in New York, product of the public school system, and I have a family that, from a very young age, encouraged me to think, to read, to debate. At dinner, we would often talk about various issues going on. I'm talking when I was quite young,
Hmm. Now,
elementary school.
you're a red diaper baby?
No, no. My parents were progressive. My mother's still alive, and she remains really feisty. But no, they're progressive. Never anti-communists. They were just progressive, and my entire family is like that. Even the on my mother's side, my great grandfather was a man named William Stanley Braithwaite.
Oh,
Uh,
really?
yes,
Yeah,
yes,
social history
yeah.
of the Negro. Yes, yes,
He
yes,
he
yes.
was he's an interesting person. Sundiata or was he was an autodidact. He had
Hmm.
left school at the age of 15 when his father died. He went to work. He grew to become, he was called the tyrant of Boston in the early 20th century because he could make break people's literary careers. He was very influential, was a major pre-Harlem Renaissance figure
Oh,
and a mentor to many figures in the Harlem Renaissance like Alain Locke, Count Cullen, and others, and developed quite a following. He was very close with Du Bois. They were close friends. He didn't have the same politics of Du Bois, but they got along very, very well. My great grandfather was a liberal, basically,
yeah.
and
He
I
might have
mean, we
been a
could.
progressive. He might have,
Was that?
he might have been a progressive. I encouraged a friend to
Mhm.
write a dissertation on birthright some 20, 30 years ago. So yeah,
Really?
yeah, oh, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, his book, A Social History of the Negro, was one of the first social histories of Black folk. Yeah, no, no, no. He's a big boy, as you're saying.
Well, he. Oh man, we could go on and on about my great grandfather.
Yeah, yeah, we
One of
can.
the most interesting things I'll just make as a side note is that he was very influential in Robert Frost's development. And he and Frost were very close.
Hmm.
And then, as my great grandmother said, who lived to the age of 100, she said, and then Frost stopped coming by to visit. So there was a biography of Frost in the 60s or 70s that came out. And in the course of it, there had been an interview with Frost at some point, and he was asked, what did he owe William Stanley Braithwaite?
Hmm.
And his answer was, I don't owe the nigga anything.
What the?
Uh, yeah, I mean, seriously. So, but anyway, this was my family encouraged me very, very much. And when I was 13, I read the autobiography of Malcolm X, and that was in and of itself transformative. I, I'd read things like Muhammad Speaks, the newspaper, the Nation of
Right.
Islam, and talk with people. I was young, um, and my parents had bought the book, and I picked it up and I read it, and I couldn't stop reading it. And when it ended, I knew exactly what I wanted to do with my life.
Okay, Bill, your story.
Mhm.
That's the same story when I talk. Our dear brother who's departed, Alman Rockman.
Yeah,
That's the story of myself. That's the story of our generation, right?
that's right.
What I want you to do though is be precise. What was it about the autobiography that was transformative for you?
So That's an interesting question. So I'm answering in a couple of different ways. I'm going to work backwards. The end of the autobiography is very perplexing, which I didn't understand until I read Marable's book
Hmm.
on Malcolm X. Um, and it was very perplexing. But the gist of the book that affected me was his transformation and his identification, particularly in the last year or so of his life,
Hmm.
of the enemy, and that and his break with the Nation of Islam and his black internationalism, a term I didn't understand at that time, but came to. It was this. He was the quintessential black internationalist. He wasn't just a Pan-Africanist.
Right,
He was a
right.
black internationalist. He appreciated these international struggles against imperialism. And
But even as a minister in the nation, he
mhm,
appreciated those
he
international
did.
struggles.
He did. And he had restrictions on him and his ability to really articulate things the way that they needed to be articulated. But the autobiography, I think the looking at his growth, the challenges that he faced, his audacity, all
Hmm.
of this affected me. And then soon thereafter, I found out about the Black Panther Party. And I said, wow, okay. So the Panthers, in my opinion, seem to be the logical legacy of Malcolm. And I was really struck by the Panthers and became very close to the Panthers. My father asked me not to join. And this was when I was like 15, 14, 15. He asked me not to join. He was very, very afraid, having lived through the McCarthy era, very afraid of me being blacklisted, very afraid of me ultimately being killed. But I was very close to the Panthers, and I was in high school doing organizing, basically under their leadership and the leadership of their line, and became more and more radical. Found out and learned and studied about socialism, Mao Zedong in China, and I was on this course, then I ended up going to college. I went to Harvard, and I was originally planning on being a lawyer. But while I was there, I lost interest in law school, the idea of law school, and
Why?
decided instead,
Why?
well,
Why? Why?
because I wanted to be part of movement building, Sundiata. I wanted to be part of um, a collective process. I wanted to be involved in organizing grassroots people.
Okay.
And I wanted to be involved with the working class, particularly. My
How did you
my
get
men
there though? Because
what's that?
the how did you get to the working class position? Because I would argue that the Panthers, even though they may have broadly organized the black working class, they're not the League of Revolutionary Black Workers. They are organizing the Brother on the Block, and Eldridge
Right.
Cleaver is talking about trying to legitimize the lumpen
That's right.
proletariat. So, how did you get to the black working class through the Panther Party?
Well, it was a sort of it's no straight line. I think it was in part that there were different tendencies within the Panthers,
Right.
and there
Right.
were those that were much more focused on the working class. But I also started hearing about the League of Revolutionary Black Workers. And I remember that, hearing about that in like 1971 or so. And and then I started studying. And while I was in college, I was in study groups, and I started studying Marxism and learning more and more about the working class. But in many ways, the pivotal thing was my principal mentor while I was in college was one Hewitt Guinier,
Ah,
the
yeah, the first
father of Lonnie
aesthetic
Guinier.
director, right?
He was what?
He was the first Black Studies director at Harvard.
That's right. It was called Afro-American Studies at the
Yes.
time, and he was the first chair of that, and was very left. Was a former trade unionist, a great instructor, and he taught his classes. The way he looked at African American history was with a class perspective and a perspective based on mass movements. It was not one of these famous Negroes I've known orientations. And so from that, I started learning more about the Black worker. And in 1974, Philip Foner's book, Organized Labor and the Black Worker,
Mhm.
came out.
Right.
And
Right.
that was like, wow. I mean, read like a novel. I mean, there was all of this stuff I had never heard about and didn't realize how central Black workers were in the trade union movement in the United States. And so ultimately, Sundiata, what happened is I decided my place needs to be in the working class and in the labor movement, and particularly because I believed, as Ganir did, and many other people, that trade unions could be utilized as instruments for Black liberation.
Okay.
Not just Black liberation, but that
Yeah,
included.
right.
And so when I graduated from college, I did very well in college, and I ultimately went to work as a welder in a shipyard, which my father did not
Oh,
appreciate.
I
He
can
was,
only imagine, Bill.
oh Lord, he just was beside himself.
Yeah.
All this money I spend on you, and you go work in a shipyard. And my mother's attitude was much more flexible. It was more like,
Hmm.
leave the boy alone. He graduated with honors, blah, blah, blah. But it was working in the shipyard, Sundiata, that was the second most important part of my education, I would say. Because as I always tell people, when you go to an Ivy League school, you're being trained to run the world.
Right.
And even when you're a radical, you can really start thinking a lot of yourself. And there are many radicals that have gone through Ivy League, and that's exactly what happens.
Yeah.
But you go to work at a shipyard, and people didn't know I'd gone to Harvard. And it's very humbling. It was the hardest work I've ever done, hardest physically.
Oh, yeah.
We worked in 100-degree weather and 15-degree weather. Constant dangers, second most dangerous industry in the country at the time. I fell 20 feet.
Mm.
And a week after someone had fallen 9 feet and died, I survived. Very, very dangerous. But I was working with people, most of whom had never been to college, and maybe they had a little time in college, working with veterans,
Mhm.
of the Vietnam War and others. And I learned from them. And most of them were very willing to coach this young kid. I was like 22,
Yeah. Yeah.
23, 22 when I went to work there. It's very humbling. It's very humbling. And you get sometimes when you read about classes and class struggle, you can kind of romanticize the working class,
That's right.
just like the Panthers romanticized the lumpen. But you can
Yeah.
romanticize the working class is not romantic. It is a very complicated
Yeah.
grouping of people and who frequently have very contradictory views
Yeah.
that they contain simultaneously.
That's right.
And that's a lot of what I learned.
Yeah. I can, in a different situation, I worked in a foundry, and then I spent 7 years after 1 year community college um, working in a rubber factory, Firestone, building tires.
Mhm.
And you indeed learn a lot about, you know, the one of the things that I would say that the capitalists taught me is that they said to us that there's no such thing as an accident. There's only human error,
Mm,
right?
right.
That was their view of the world.
Hmm.
You made a mistake that you need to pay for.
Right.
Yeah, yeah. That's
Right.
good. So
Absolutely.
but you move into various movement spaces. So
Yes.
can you talk briefly about those experiences? And I'm thinking Freedom Roads, Black Radical Congress, Trans Africa, and I know there are formations before that.
So while I was in school, in college, I mean, I was someone who was always forming or joining organizations. I believe very much in organization. And while I was in college, I and some other people formed a Marxist collective, and we um, we were hoping to be part of a movement to build a new party.
Okay, so you're part of the new Communist Party building movement.
Yeah, that movement,
Okay,
sometimes called a
yeah,
Maoist,
yeah.
um, and I was part of that. And that ultimately led me, our collective merged with some other organizations. Um, and I ended up in Freedom Road and then Liberation Road.
Okay.
And but
Were you
I
in the October League at one point?
the October League, no,
Okay,
no.
okay.
I have many friends that were in the OL, but I wasn't. And but I've never been someone who's been exclusively in one organization. So I've helped to build different kinds of organizations that serve different purposes. And one case in point is when you and I met with the building of the Black Radical Congress.
Right, right.
Um, and I've been in the Democratic Socialists of America, a number of different groups, and try to do whatever I can to add value. But also, building organization is also recognizing the moment. That was one
Mm,
of the things about the Black Radical Congress that I was so proud of, that we recognized that there was a particular moment in the late 90s
yeah,
when there were disparate groups and individuals, Black radicals, that were less than the sum of their parts. And that there was a possibility, though, that we could bridge a lot of differences and build a common ground. And we did for a while.
yeah. We did, we did.
I was very happy about that. I thought, though, that one of the problems that we ran up against there, as I've run up against elsewhere, is that if you're going to build with the intention of winning and fighting for power, there is very little room for purism. That you have to retain your integrity, but you also have to be willing to recognize that, to paraphrase something I once heard, if you're in a group with everybody you like, you're probably in the wrong group. And that you need to have an organization that's broad enough that you're going to have different kinds of folks, and there's going to be differences of opinion. And the question is not whether there's differences, there are how are the differences resolved.
Right.
And in the BRC, we made a lot of mistakes. I say we collectively, I include myself.
Well,
Um, and unfortunately, I mean, we were able to sustain the BRC for 10 years,
yeah.
and many other
I
organizations
think
can't say that.
I'm compelled to confess that I made a major error, as you well know, during that period, and certainly contributed to much turmoil inside the BRC. at that time, and so
We
yeah,
all
I
made
mean,
mistakes, bro.
yeah, we do,
We did.
and
I
that's
mean,
what I'm gonna carry with me, bro.
well, I appreciate you saying that. Let me give an example of one of the mistakes that I made, and from which I learned a great deal from Sunyata. Um, you may remember in 2003, there was this open letter critical of Zimbabwean President Robert Mugabe for the
Absolutely,
repression, right?
absolutely.
And the repression that was going on against his opponents, and a number of things, including sending bulldozers through communities, things like that. So I was on the coordinating committee of the BRC, and we were approached about this, whether we wanted to join. And so I brought it to the coordinating committee, having no idea how people would respond. And unanimously, people said, no, 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 we absolutely have to sign this.
Right.
Well, I was sort of surprised by that, but I said, wow, that's fantastic. So we signed on. And then there was a complete blow up, as you may remember. And it turned out that a sizable portion of the membership, not a majority, but a sizable portion, objected to our signing on to this.
Absolutely.
And right. And the mistake that I made was that while technically the coordinating committee had the absolute right to sign on to such a thing, politically,
Yeah.
we needed to have touched base with more folks in the organization before we took that step. And I think that I deceived myself, I guess you'd say, by the fact that the coordinating committee had unanimously said, no, we should sign it.
There were very diverse opinions on that coordinating committee, and that's probably one of the few things that we were unanimous on.
That's right. Absolutely. And it was a mistake. And I'll tell you, bro, I learned from that. And I've, in a lot of the work that I do, because I do various kinds of organizational consulting, I remind leaders that even when you have the right to make a decision, you have to make sure that politically you touch base with key people in the organization when you know something is going to be controversial. And we knew that the Mugabe issue would be controversial, but in some ways we thought that the repression was so blatant that it wouldn't be that bad, but it was. And so you learn. So we've all made mistakes.
Well, that's part of being active, brother. We learn from the
Precisely.
mistakes, and we must make them. So Bill, I want to. I got this question, and it comes from a Du Bois statement. I don't want. I just want you to hit it, and and get out.
Mhm.
But Du Bois famously said that Harvard has ruined more Negroes than bad whiskey. And so, how, how did you go to Harvard, graduate with honors, and not be ruined?
What a question. Man, there were some great people that I met there, including the woman I married. And we've been together as a couple for almost 50 years and been married for a little bit less than that. Um, Harvard can do a lot of things to you when you operate as an individual.
Mm,
And I was fortunate enough to surround myself with some really good people, very fine people who were progressive, if not radical, committed to social change, were activists on campus. And it really helped to uh, beat back some of the worst tendencies there. I also had some great professors. Ganir, I mentioned, Arthur McEwen, who was an economist, who was the only economist when I was an undergrad that made any sense. I tried going into the introductory economics class. It didn't make any sense to me. No, it's just like this doesn't make any sense. But McEwen taught this Marxism class, Marxist economics, and it just made perfect
Wait, this
sense.
is Marshall McLuhan, the medium is domestic.
No, Arthur.
Oh, Arthur. Okay,
Yeah,
okay.
Arthur McEwen.
Yeah, I was a little confused.
Yeah, he went on. Harvard got rid of most of its Marxist professors, including him, and he went to University of Massachusetts, Boston, for the rest of his career. But he was an incredible instructor and broke it down. So there was ways of surviving,
Okay.
but it's a very hard place because, particularly freshman year, they don't make it easy for you, and there is a lot of pressure on people not only to succeed but to present themselves as if they got it going on. You're not supposed to exhibit any self-doubt. And as a result, some people go crazy, people commit suicide, people leave. I think being a product of public school really helped me.
Okay. Good. So, one of the things that I've heard people say over the years, this was actually the last issue that I edited of the Black Scholar before I was purged, right? And then Eula, of course, joined me in political solidarity. But it was an issue on the Black Liberation Movement, and you and Jamala Rogers wrote a retrospective
Oh yeah.
of the BRC. No one said that it would be easy. 9 lessons learned from building the Black Radical Congress. Various people, including Gerald Horne, has said that that was an extraordinarily important piece. So, in it, you offered 9 recommendations about principles, organizational structure, and relationships amongst different factions, for lack of a better term. Can you summarize those recommendations and discuss them? And do you still see those recommendations that you made in 2014 as valid for a thrust toward a new Black radical united front?
I think that the original was like 16 lessons. I think you might have.
Yeah. Oh, you're right.
9,
Editorially, I
right?
combined
You
and
combined them, right?
You're right. It
And
was 16. Yeah.
I appreciate that. Actually, I didn't know that you had been purged from the Black Scholar. I actually did not know what happened. But
Yeah.
I appreciated your having us do that. It would be very hard for me to summarize all of them, but I'll say that there's a few things. There's a number of things that we tried to get at there, and the short answer is yes. I think it's absolutely. I mean, I looked them over a couple of weeks ago, actually, and I think that they're just as relevant as when we wrote them.
So grab the most salient.
That there's a big difference between organizing a conference and organizing an organization.
Yeah.
And that the conference we had in June of '98 was simply phenomenal. And I remember Sundiata in the preparation, we had thought maybe we'll get a few hundred people. And then all of a sudden, I think there was an article in the Wall Street Journal about this gathering that was gearing up. And then I remember on the day that it started, I was there in the registration area, and people kept coming in and coming in, and I'm saying, damn, right? And it's like I kept running to the telephone to call my wife and say, Candace, you wouldn't believe what's happening here. And I think over the course of the weekend, there were about 3,000 people over the course of the weekend. And at any one time, there were about 1,500 people participating. generational.
Yeah.
I mean, it was wonderful. The problem was that it was so good that doing the transition into building an organization was very, very challenging. And particularly when you realize you got all this energy, but the energy didn't automatically translate into people agreeing on all the principles that were necessary to build an organization, and particularly priorities. I remember having a discussion with um, Kathy Cohen from
Hmm.
Chicago, very
Yeah.
important in the founding. And she said, Bill, we shouldn't have spent as much time on organization building. We should have started a campaign. And this is a few years later. I said, Kathy, that's interesting, except for one problem. Which campaign?
Yeah.
I mean, there were multiple campaigns
Right.
that were
Right.
being discussed.
Right.
So I think, and particularly with all due respect to academics, there are many academics that know how to build great conferences, but don't know how to translate that into building organization. That's one important lesson.
Yes.
A second is about fundraising. That it's really challenging, and some people that have experienced the Black Lives Matter upsurge will not appreciate what I'm saying, because there was so much money flowing towards Black Lives Matter that many people misread stuff. We were damn near begging for money with the Black
Yeah.
Radical Congress.
Yeah.
And this whole debate, as you may remember, around whether to take money from a foundation or
Right.
not, issue of how to raise resources, obtain them, is something that haunts all progressive and radical efforts. And one challenge right now that we see with the Trump regime that's come in is, I don't call them an administration. This is a regime.
Right.
This is a regime change. This Trump regime is going to be going after nonprofits, and many groups have avoided the question of fundraising. And so that was one. That was another lesson that was important. A third that I would say is that it's very difficult building an organization which is both an organization of organizations and an organization of individuals,
Yeah.
because the BRC was in many respects built on a basis of the convergence of several organizations
Right.
that included the New African People's Organization / Malcolm X Grassroots, the CP, Freedom Road, and committees of correspondence with democracy and socialism, and then a couple of other organizations, um, one of Marxist humanists. So there were, and then there were organizations like the Organization
There
for
were
the Black
local
Struggle.
organizations like Black, Organization for
Right,
Black Struggle St. Louis, which I was operating out of at the
right.
time. Yeah.
That all of which played a major role. The problem then is, okay, so you form this organization. What is the role for those organizations that have been the initiators versus the role of individuals who come in, join, and might constitute chapters? We never worked that out very well. And one of the results of that was losing some of the organizations that had been there from the very beginning. They pulled back. Um, and that was a challenge. The difficulty we had in focusing, as you may remember, we ended up having 4 campaigns plus the Hands Off Assata
Yeah.
effort.
Yeah.
And on the one hand, the idea was sort of decentralizing, that you have these different campaigns and campaign committees, so people would have different options. The difficulty, though, was when you didn't have sufficient money for staff you were relying on volunteers. And without naming names, there was some of those where there'd be individuals that insisted that they would be good and effective chairs, and they dropped the ball.
Yeah.
And the work just kind of unraveled. So I think that there were problems along those lines. And then the example I gave about the mistake we made around Mugabe and what leaders have to be thinking about. Now, one of the things I'm really proud of is that the BRC was very openly and practically anti-sexist
Yes.
and anti-heterosexist.
Right.
And that distinguished it from many other Black radical organizations that were homophobic or took a pass on it or whatever. And it was very central to who we were as an organization. I was extremely proud that we had that stand. So those are some of the. There's one other thing I was thinking about, bro. That
the thing that comes to mind for me is that you and Jamala talked about how do you build an organization and who takes responsibility. And I thought the argument that those people who are doing the work have to be seen as the core. And then we have to talk about people who are outer rings, right?
I think that's right.
Very important, because I think in various ways we move decision making away from the people who were actually on the ground doing the work.
I think I would to a great extent agree with you, not entirely, but it was easy to lose touch with people on the ground in the absence of a stronger infrastructure. So our national council, as you remember, met, I think, 3 times a year.
Yeah, we met 3 times a year.
Yeah. And it was representatives of all of our local organizing committees. Thought that was very good. And we had a coordinating committee that was supposed to meet more frequently, which basically it did. We needed more resources in order to deploy organizers that could be in touch with the local organizing committees to help the local organizing committees. We never had those kind of resources. We only had enough money basically for one national organizer, and it couldn't possibly do all that was necessary. And it was interesting because when I later found out, with the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement, the money that was flowing at them, I remember talking to Jamala. I said, we would have been ecstatic to have had even a percentage of the resources that they were getting.
Yeah.
And then to see ultimately what happened.
I think we would have been before that, right? It's not just the era, but it's who we were.
Yeah.
We weren't throwing that kind of money at us.
No, they weren't.
No,
it's absolutely true.
They would not. That's the point I'm trying to make.
That's right.
They would not have.
That's right. Yeah. I think the other thing that occurs to me, class was very important to us in the BRC, but there was a mistake. I would argue a mistake that we made in not understanding something about the moment. So we were formed in 98.
Mm-hmm.
There was a new leadership that had taken over the National AFL-CIO at the end of 1995 under John Sweeney. Right. And it had committed to increasing support for organizing, and it broke with much of the anti-communism that had preceded it, and was willing to hire people, in fact, like me, who were very open leftists. And I argued in the BRC that much like the National Negro Congress in
Mhm.
1936, that this was a moment when we should have linked up much more with labor, or at least a section of labor,
Right, right.
because I was convinced that we could play a pivotal role in helping to transform labor and organize.
So, how do you
Got a lot
account
of pushback.
for the fact that the BRC was largely composed of people who thought of themselves as Marxists and social democrats? How is it we did not make the turn toward labor organizing?
Because
We
I think,
said to support dock workers, but we
right,
never
we did,
made labor central.
right. Um, so you're right. We got involved in and played an important role in the Charleston Five defense campaign in 2000, 2001. I think part of the problem, Sundiata, is that um, for many of our members, class, even though we upheld it, was an abstraction. And the labor movement in particular was something that many of our members downplayed because of histories of racism within the labor movement. And so there was also the rise of a kind of postmodern
Yeah,
um,
yeah. Postmodern
equivalence
emotions
of all
coming out of the academies.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, and it's equivalence of all struggles. Like, in other words, the idea of prioritizing doing something with the labor movement. And I remember having these discussions, and people would say, "Well, why should we do that? I mean,
yeah,
that's giving a priority to that movement, and that isn't right. We shouldn't be prioritizing any one movement." And I think that was in part the infection of postmodernism, and not recognizing not just that labor has a special role, but that this was a particular moment in history
yeah.
when there were some really interesting developments that we could have influenced.
No, no, absolutely. Bill, I want to go to some things that are a bit more contemporary and get your take on. And based on comments I've seen, we need to make sure that that we have time for you to respond to comments.
How much time do we have, by the way, Cynthia?
We're going to 8:30.
Okay,
So
can I
that
ask you to? I have to deal with something really quick, and I'll be
okay,
right back, really quick.
okay, go do it.
Apologies. Thank you. Sorry, when you're a consultant,
No problem. So I want
no,
to go.
no, just sorry about that.
Great. So, Bill,
Yes.
when I interviewed you, it turns out it was May of 2021. And
Okay.
at that time, and I think my memory is correct, you argued that Trump was not a fascist
Right.
and that the historic bloc that he was building was authoritarian.
Right.
But in a December 17th piece entitled Labor's Barbarossa Moment, referring to the Second World War and the Soviet Union's
Right.
misunderstanding and setting themselves up to be invaded by the Nazis, you came out and argued that fascism is coming. And
Yes.
you said that the unions have ignored the sign. So you revised your position. Why?
Yes.
And what's the distinction between authoritarianism and fascism, and why does it matter?
Really important question. I revised it because Trump and the MAGA movement have evolved. So my analysis was that leading up to 2016, we had what's called a right-wing populist movement,
Right.
and it has authoritarian characteristics. Within it are frequently fascist, but um, it is usually agreeing to operate sort of within the bounds of democratic capitalism,
Okay.
even when it pushes the limits. But what started to happen and become clearer both during the Trump administration and then afterwards was that the movement itself was radicalizing, and that their objective was to overthrow the 20th century, to basically take us back. This is why Trump's reference to McKinley, President McKinley, in his inaugural address was not just about that mountain. It's a symbolic importance to the far right. It's the era of McKinley, like around the time of the Spanish-American War.
This is the era
In,
of imperialism and the second
that's
they
right.
did.
This is when America was great as far as they're concerned. We've often wondered, like, when are they talking about? That's when they're talking about. So, but what's now happening, and we can see it in the last several weeks with Project 2025, is that they're talking about a radical restructuring of the U.S. state.
That's right.
They're not talking about getting rid of capitalism. They're talking about a radical restructuring. They're also talking about the emergence of a sort of kleptocracy
Back to
within it.
that national
And
capital.
it's right, but it's not just that. It's they're introducing more people. I mean, corruption, kleptocracy, right? The
Yeah, it's
introduction,
kleptocracy, theft.
right? And so we're looking at a new regime. So it's not just the Trump administration. This is a new regime. This is something different. None of the people no one alive in the United States has lived through this unless they were, and even if you lived through the McCarthy era, there
Yeah,
was still big differences in terms of the way that the state was operating.
right.
And so that's what I was getting at, Sundiata, that there is this transformation, and they are very clear with what we are seeing now with efforts to basically erase African Americans and Latinos and many Asians and certainly Native Americans. This attack on DEI is not about DEI; it's about erasing us.
That's right.
And so that's why, Sundiata.
Okay, well, that makes perfect sense, and I would agree with you that that transformation began to occur in 2020, but it's in the period when he's out that the right wing intelligentsia come and do the work, so that what we've now seen is a full blown thrust toward fascism.
That's right.
So recently, you and Carl Davison authored a revision of your post 2020 election analysis.
Correct.
And that appeared in Liberation Road's newspaper, which is, I would encourage people to begin to read that regularly. I think some of
Thank
the
you.
best analysis are occurring there. But can you elaborate on the analysis that you made with Davison about the 2020 election and what aspects of it apply to 2024? And I want to highlight this point because I think this is where we on the left and even black folk who are not radicals went drastically off the rails. The notion that the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, because they are both capitalist parties, are the same thing,
Right.
and that they constitute the same strata and factions of the ruling racial class. So, can you discuss what makes the strategic visions that the Democratic Party and the Republican Party are pursuing? And one of the things you and Davidson say in that article, is that the Democratic Party is not so much a political party as it is a series of three alliances of three different factions, while the Republican Party also is an alliance of three different factions, but that the fascist MAGA faction dominates that historic bloc.
Correct. So, U.S. political parties, the two major parties, because we have a very undemocratic electoral system, it encourages the formation of two parties because it's very difficult for third parties to emerge beyond a certain level. And what that ends up meaning is that the parties become alliances. So they're not parties in the way that you might have, like in France or Germany.
Right.
They are, or Italy, they're alliances. So I think of the Democratic Party alliance or the Republican Party alliance. Now, what's happened with the Republicans is that largely due to an effort that started in the late 1960s by people who would go on to be called the New Right, there was an effort to build an authoritarian bloc within the Republican Party that we call the New Confederacy.
Yeah.
And this was an alignment of ultimately of Christian fundamentalists, various corporate types, etc., that wanted to shift the Republican Party more and more towards the right.
What do you
And
put
they
the
moved.
neocon intellectuals, who many of whom have been socialists and communists in the 40s,
Mhm.
who then begin to become the intelligentsia of the neocon movement prior to the 80s? So I'm talking about Nathan Glazer, those folks.
Right. The people I'm talking about are like Richard Viguerie and Paul Weyrich. They were never on the
Oh,
left,
ooh,
right? These were the
yeah,
people
yeah.
that really coming out of the Goldwater campaign begin the steps that take us to today. And so they developed a multi-decade strategy that was aimed at cleansing the Republican Party of its liberal wing. So the Republican Party, the liberal wing, with people like Nelson Rockefeller, Jacob Javits, and countless others who
Ed
were
Brooks.
viewed as legitimate participants in the Republican Party. And interestingly, Weyrich and Viguerie looked at Richard Nixon as a liberal. So, but they were willing to ally with Nixon because they saw opportunities. So part of what Carl Davidson and I are getting at is that this right-wing effort moves and it starts pushing the liberals out of the Republican Party. And as a result, it creates a situation where the base for opposition to authoritarians in the Republican Party starts to diminish. Less and less of a presence there until ultimately we have, after Obama's elected, the rise of the Tea Party movement. Now,
Yeah.
one of the things about the Republican Party establishment was that the Republican Party establishment was not fascist. I mean, there
Right.
were capitalists, there were many authoritarians, opportunists, etc., but they weren't really fascists. But they were content to watch the rise of a right-wing populist movement that included fascists because they made the mistake that Dr. Frankenstein made. They thought they could control the monster. They
Mm.
thought the monster that they
Yeah.
created, that they would continue to control but the monster had other ideas. And that's what happens during the Tea Party movement. That the Tea Party becomes an expression of this monster, this right-wing populist monster,
Mhm.
merges with the birther movement and others, and brings us Donald Trump. The Democrats, and I should say, and the Republican Party have become a hard right-wing authoritarian party, and we can see in the recent committee decisions
Yeah,
on
yeah,
Trump's cabinet that no one will buck him.
that's right.
Everyone is
They
afraid to
couldn't
buck
have done that under George uh, Bush
him. Right.
Shrub, the son. They
George
could have
W.
done that
Right.
then. Right, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So now you have this hard right-wing authoritarian party, and the Democrats, Kamala Harris, made a mistake in assuming that there was still within the Republican electorate a significant block of people who hated Trump and would be open to coming in her direction.
right.
I understand that impulse because she looked at Nikki Haley's vote, right? But it was wrong because at the end of the day,
In
they
for
weren't.
every year where they should have directed the money toward expanding the base amongst black folk,
Oh
right?
no, for sure.
Dealing with voter suppression. But yeah, that was clearly a strategic error.
Right, but it's an understandable one when you have a whole segment of the Republican establishment breaking from Trump and including, I think, all of his cabinet members from his first administration who said this guy is dangerous.
Yeah.
So it was not an irrational move. It just turned out to be wrong. Um, the
But
Democrats,
logically, it's also a view of the white working class. Despite what Lyndon Johnson told you when he said we're going to lose the white South for a generation, it's now turned out to be more than two generations.
that's right.
They thought that they could, by focusing on economic questions, bring back the white working class. This is where the term you use is race and revanchism, meaning
Right.
it's revenge seeking, grievance, destroy black folk.
That's right.
That the Democrats have never been able to see that. I
They
should say,
don't.
at least those who dominate
Right.
that alliance have always rejected that analysis.
Well, it's interesting because it's been rejected within the Democratic Party by the right and the left.
Yeah,
So you have people like Bernie Sanders, who I'm very supportive of, but he came out of the election as he did out of 2016, saying that had the Democrats had a progressive economic populist message, they would have won the election. And my response was, did you watch Madison Square Garden?
mm,
It's like if you watch the Madison Square Garden rally, that wasn't about economics. I mean, just think about the different things. The Madison Square Garden rally should have killed the Trump campaign, should have killed
absolutely
it.
should have.
And instead people embraced it. No, there's more to it than economics. And exactly the issue of revanchism, which is a term that is used much more in Europe than here,
Right.
as you said, Sundiata, is a politics of revenge and resentment, a politics that says something was taken from us and we're going to take it back. And so in the Democratic Party, you have these multiple parties. You have the Congressional Progressive Caucus, you have what's left of the Blue Dogs, and you have other forces there. It's not a united party or a united bloc. So the Republicans have the advantage right now of operating within an authoritarian party that is very top down and where there's a price to be paid, and they make it very clear there's a price to be paid if you buck Trump.
That's right.
And most of these Republican elected officials are too cowardly to take him on.
So, understanding the fractions, with the fractures within the Democratic Alliance,
Mhm.
it still seems at a certain level intellectual. How do you replicate the mistake that Bill Clinton and Al Gore made in terms of the Democratic, what was that, Leadership Council,
Yeah,
which
Democratic Leadership
also
Council.
put forward the notion that this is about class. We've got to appeal to the white working class, while
Well,
actually taking the neoliberal road, but the rhetoric was bring back work. I don't see the appeal coming from the Democratic Party today, the dominant appeal, being much different than what Clinton argued in the 90s.
well,
Erroneous.
Biden's policies were very different from
Well,
Clinton's.
Biden, certainly Biden's policies were an attempt to break with neoliberalism
Right.
and to return to a kind of Keynesian, build strong labor
Something
unions.
like that. That's right. That's
This is the
right.
thing that really shocked me is how the hell did folks on the left not understand that Biden and Harris was making a fundamental break with neoliberalism? That's what they sought to do.
I agree with you. How did people not see it? I think in part because much of the left is one or two dimensional. It doesn't look at reality. It looks more at elements of reality and then fills in some of the blanks. So what Biden was doing was complicated because he was breaking from neoliberalism on certain
Right,
levels,
right, right.
not entirely. And he made a mistake that some writers have pointed out, analysts have pointed out, that when some of the programs that have been instituted at the height of the pandemic, when they expired and were under attack from Republicans, Biden administration didn't come to their defense. And we still don't know why. They allowed things to expire, and no one seems to know why that happened. The other thing is that when Harris was running, and this relates to, I think, part of your point earlier, she seemed to think that the reality of Trump, what we knew about Trump, what we knew about Project 2025, would be enough to consolidate her base.
Yes.
And that what she then needed was just to win over a segment of the Republicans.
Right.
And she missed this. And I think there's a guy, Mike Parharza, who's done some excellent work on the election and has basically pointed out that leaving aside voter purging and others, voter suppression, which Greg Palast has written about,
Absolutely.
where he argues that Harris could have and should have won had it not been for various suppression.
Well, the suppression of, I think he has 2 to 3 million black voters
That's right.
suppressed.
That's right.
Absolutely.
But so you had that, but you also had people that sat out the election, and they sat it out for any number of reasons. Gaza,
Yeah.
and the horrendous position taken by the administration, or they might have sat it out because of their economic situation had not qualitatively improved, or because of inflation, or because of misinformation. I mean, there's a lot of propaganda that was going on, any number of things, but a lot of people sat it out. And Harris was not counting on that. And that was, as you said, it was a big mistake. And the resources should have been put into going after those, there's a term for it, but sort of irregular voters.
Right.
The people
Right.
don't vote all the time.
So thank you for that, Bill, for that very thoughtful and detailed answer. This is the last question I want to ask, and then I want to go to the chat. So you argue that the current task is to build organizations and campaigns, not movements. And I think we share this notion that movements are spontaneous, and they're like waves on the ocean. They repeatedly come, but the typical movement lasts 4 to 7 years.
That's right.
So it's not movement; it's organizations that are and can't be, that's substantive. But here's the issue that I want to raise. Certainly, if you read the literature on the civil rights movement and Black Power by African Americans, Alden Morris is the origin of the civil rights movement. Even Charles Payne, who's so anti-Black power that I find him disgusting. But his book, I've Got the Light of Freedom, the organizing tradition in the Mississippi freedom struggle, where he's very clear in distinguishing the organizing tradition from the mobilizing tradition.
Mm-hmm.
Those works have had a certain impact inside the Black movement, but the dominant work of the left is still Piven and Cloward's, right? Poor people's movements, which which opposes the Saul Alinsky model of building organization, and of course opposes Lenin's vanguard notion, right?
Mm-hmm.
And pushes the idea of this kind of syndicalist, spontaneous, anarchistic movement that pops up that will make change. Even Boots Riley talks about that we got to have a general strike.
Right.
So, can you talk about why that is so wrongheaded, and that what's important for us to do is build strong, sustaining organizations that are able to then guide movements when they erupt?
I think that the issue comes down to the politics of self-expression, the politics of protest, and the politics of power. And that many of our colleagues, friends, are trapped in the first two and have nothing to do with the third. Because the problem is that when the politics of self-expression can be seen, for example, in the lead up to the election, where people saying, I am so furious with this administration that around Gaza that I'm not going to vote for them because I want to teach the Democrats a lesson. So that's the politics of self-expression. And the politics of protest it's like, it doesn't matter who's elected, we're going to be out there in the streets protesting, and we're going to try to influence the elites. Then there's the politics of power. That is the politics of aiming to win. That's what I'm interested in.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, many people, and this was something, frankly, Sundiata, I think that haunted us in the BRC, that there were many people that were afraid of winning, because in order to build a politics to win, you have to make uncomfortable alliances. I remember, and I want to say Sundiata was around 2000, the BRC was right on the edge of becoming a recognized phenomena within Black America. I don't mean just in the Black left, but we were starting to get the right kind of attention. And there were people who will go nameless, I think, that were scared to death of that. Because the moment you move into this broader sphere, purism has no place in it. And you've got to figure out how to work different alliances. So Cloward and Piven, with all due respect, and I'm very fond of Francis, they are very inspired by a sort of, as you said, an anarcho-syndicalist, spontaneous view. And there are other people that take a similar view, which is that our job is not to win. Our job is to influence the elites to do the right thing until, and this is when it gets magical, until that great moment arises when the masses rise up in their millions and seize power. So there's this huge jump from we're going to protest to force the elites to do things, and then all of a sudden the tidal wave of the masses emerges and everything changes, as opposed to the nuts and bolts of fighting to win, of fighting at the municipal level, the county level, the state level, etc., which is more than just elections. It's in many cases building institutions, alternative institutions, parallel institutions, and that would be that's my answer.
To provide quality of life services to improve Black communities and
That's right.
communities of other darker peoples and the working class in general.
Precisely.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Yeah. So, Bill, do you have any announcements, any statements, or you want to do a wrap up before we go to the chat?
Oh, I want to encourage people to read my novels. That's another part of my life that I discovered a few years ago. I've published 2 murder mysteries, and the manuscript for the 3rd in the series is being read by a publisher right now. And it's
what's the name, Bill?
Okay, the first one is The Man Who Fell from the Sky, and the second one is The Man Who Changed Colors. And they take place in the 1970s in Massachusetts and situated among Cape Verdean Americans, Cape Verdeans being the first post-1492 African population to come to the United States voluntarily.
Absolutely.
And I decided to play.
In Boston?
What's that?
It's set in Boston?
It's set in Cape Cod. The first one is set in Cape Cod, and the second one is set in Cape Cod and New Bedford. The third one is set in Boston. And although there's a major scene that takes place in Cape Cod, I decided, Sundiata, I wanted to do something. I've always dreamed up stories, but I wanted to write a novel, and I wanted to introduce politics, and I wanted to talk about race, but race in a different way, which you can do when you talk about Cape Verdeans, because their experience was having come from the Portuguese colonial version of white supremacy, which was very different from the English white supremacist version. And so I got into a lot of things. And some people said, Bill, well, why didn't you just write a book about Cape Verdeans? I said, because no one would read it. I'm not an expert on Cape Verdeans.
But, I also remember back in the 90s, we used to talk about the Blanche novels.
Yes, that's right.
So that was an inspiration, I presume.
Yes, they were, and Walter Mosley. Walter Mosley was a major inspiration for me. Danny Glover was an emotional inspiration for me. Danny kept pressing me on. I mean, going back to my very first manuscript, which didn't go anywhere, but still he was there for me. And then the Blanche novels, and I'm drawing a blank on the author. I knew the author.
So am I. Which is embarrassing for both.
She passed away.
Yeah, she did pass away.
And they were, but particularly the Mosley novels, really, they got me. And the 1940s film noir. That was very inspiring because I like the complexity of characters in film noir. So anyway, I'll leave it at that. I encourage your viewers and listeners to check out those novels. If you're in the murder mysteries, I promise you'll enjoy them.
Okay, I've got one, and I need to get it finished. So,
all right.
Bill, there's a comment that was early put on by David Silberg, and the comment is, this is actually before the show started. Bill Fletcher and Black liberation don't go together.
So I don't know the guy. I don't even know whether he's a robot, a cop, or anything. I don't know who it is. I don't know whether it's an imaginary person. It's comments like that that are make me think about the Wizard of Oz. And it's like in the Wizard of Oz, the wizard hid behind a curtain. Right. And when he was behind a curtain, he was really evil and threatening and everything. Then you pulled the curtain back, and it was this grandfatherly guy, right? And I have found that in the era of social media, there are a lot of people that hide behind the curtain of the keyboard, and they say the most despicable, insulting things because there's no accountability, Sundar. And there's no sense of we're going to be constructive because we can just tear people down. And so I don't know who this guy is, and God bless him. That's his point of view. But it's not it's the kind of
Your personal history makes that comment, as you say, something that someone who is either attempting to engage in sabotage,
right.
it just has no connection to reality.
It doesn't, and it's very dangerous. I when the Russians invaded Ukraine, I spoke out in support of Ukraine and support of them getting guns or weapons from whoever was going to give them because they got to stop the Russian
Yeah,
aggression.
right.
And there were people I knew who will go nameless, who attacked me, called me everything but a child of God. And one person in particular denounced me as an enemy. And I reached out to him because I've known the guy for a long time. And I said, you and I are old enough to remember COINTELPRO.
Mm-hmm.
And we know what happens when people start throwing things around, that there are consequences that can happen and unintended, perhaps, but happen nevertheless, because someone interprets certain words as more than just words.
That's right.
And I said to this person, I would suggest that we back away from that. I'm not interested in getting in a firefight with someone and let alone be a target of someone. And I think that words, it's not one of those things we were told as kids that sticks and stones will break your bones, but names will never hurt you. That was
Yeah.
actually a lie. Names
Yeah,
will hurt you.
BS.
Right.
Right. You have to dehumanize before you can exterminate.
That's
So
exactly right.
moving quickly, and I'm going to take the answer that you just gave as that it covers the statement by David Warshauer, which is ask this NATO mug how he feels about the persecution of the people in the Donbass and Lucas. So in other words, a pro-Russian comment.
Yeah.
And we'll just let that go. Now, A.B. Baraka, I presume this is a Jamu, says, Bill, the very fact that the CC, meaning we're talking about the BRC coordinating committee, signed and didn't understand the controversy that would erupt reflects the weakness and alienation of that leadership.
I would agree in part. I think that he's right. It demonstrated the weakness. I think it demonstrated that there was a section of the BRC that we weren't sufficiently in touch with. I think it as I said, it was a mistake, and I'm very self-critical about it, and have been for a while. I don't know about the alienation part,
Yeah.
but that sounds more like just ad hominem. But I think that he's right. It was definitely a weakness, and it's a weakness that I've seen in many organizations. People can make mistakes when they do not ensure that they have the right kind of communication with all segments of an organization. And so I appreciate that.
So Jason Kukulo says, with the blue collar workers voting opposite their interests by voting for Trump, how can we get around the brainwashing? I need my SSI, SNAP, and college aid.
Well, let's be clear that I haven't seen the final stats. Most union members voted for Harris.
Majority of union members, 78% of Jews, non-evangelical Christians and non-Christians, and white people 18 to 29, they tied in their vote between Harris
Right.
and Trump, but those other white groups voted for Harris.
Which is the majority of whites have voted Republican pretty consistently for
Yeah,
years.
for years.
And I believe most working class people voted for Harris, but I'm not sure.
No,
Most, the
no.
total.
Most union members voted for Harris, but most white workers voted for
No, I
Trump.
didn't say white workers. I said, see,
Most workers.
ding, 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 ding,
Oh,
ding.
yes.
Right. No,
Absolutely,
this is very
absolutely.
important, right?
Yeah,
Because what's happened is that the media makes white workers the working class, right? So I think we have to be, but I think to the question, very important question. So we are in a situation now where, in part because of deregulation of the media, and the active siege or expansion of right-wing media, that there is a bubble that's around a lot of people, and Fox News is an example, that
mhm.
reinforces all kinds of misinformation. We have to figure out a way of working in and around that bubble. And so that includes alternative media. It includes making use of, and this is one of the reasons that unions become very important, to create breakthroughs in the segments of the population that we're not going to normally be interacting with, and where we can start to provide various educational opportunities. So one of the projects I'm working on is something called Standing for Democracy, which is this anti-fascist worker project. And
Right.
so one of the things that we want to do is educational work about who is the far right, what are their objectives, et cetera, et cetera. So that's part of the answer as well. Another part is that we have to rebuild local media,
Yes.
um, and that's both local printed media, but also
Radio
locally focused
stations. Yeah.
online media,
Yeah.
which has been disappearing. This is going to be a hard road, and we have to understand this is, as they say, an asymmetric battle. We're not going to have the resources that Fox News has.
Right.
We should not continue crying about that. The oppressed never have the resources of the oppressor. So it's always asymmetric. So we've got to figure out how we navigate that. But the person that put this thing in the chat is absolutely right to flag this. That's a lot of what we're up against.
Yeah. Yeah. So now, Josh Ingram raises the question that people did not vote for Harris, didn't think Trump was going to be better on Gaza. And he's basically asking about Malcolm's analogy of the fox and the wolf. I think I got that right. I just wrote a column on that, and I think Malcolm got it wrong.
Mhm.
Right? I'd rather find myself in the forest confronting a skulk of foxes than confronting a pack of wolves. I think
Mhm.
wolves are always more deadly. How would you respond to that? Right?
Wolves are smarter too.
The foxes are the liberal Democrats, and the wolves are the ravenous, rapacious Republicans.
Yeah, see, I don't think that that analogy helps us at
Right.
all in terms of understanding the current situation. I mean, right now, we're looking at a whole group of unauthorized people grabbing the information for millions of people. We're watching the dismantling of the EPA, of USAID, of countless other. They're going after the Department of Education. They want to cripple the National Labor Relations Board. They want to deep six the Department of Labor. I mean, this is on a very different scale. This is not a Tweedledee Tweedledum.
That's right.
The other part of it is that this group um, is, and this is the other thing that we didn't talk about, Sundiata, they're prepared to unite with and work with the paramilitary right.
That's right.
So the pardons of the January 6th coup people, all of them, which blew away actually many police officers who were really stunned by the pardon, basically has said there is a place for you in this block, in the Trump block. This is a much more dangerous era. So we're looking at something that could fast approach a kind of Northern Ireland or Colombia situation
Mm-hmm.
of extrajudicial violence with the veneer of constitutional democracy. And so it's in this situation we've got to figure out who you take down first. So it's like, so let's use a different analogy. You're in an alley, and there's a couple of people that are approaching you, and they look very threatening. Do you attempt to hit both of them at the same time? Or do you pick between the two?
That's right.
Right? I mean,
Right.
it's a matter of
You always got to go at someone first.
Right. Right. And sometimes the blow you strike will have an impact on the willingness or the ability of the other person to fight. And so I think we've got to look at concrete assessments and analogies, with all due respect to Malcolm, analogies made 60 years ago that might have been apt then, or may not have been.
It may not have been,
right?
Even then. Yeah.
Even then, but were provocative, don't necessarily help us understand the moment that we're in right now. And this is true not just for the Malcolm analogy or analogies, but you can't look at the world as if this is 1964.
You surely can. Bill, we're at 8:32, but I do want to give you time to wrap up an analysis in which you talk about making the understanding who the adversaries are and making selections in terms of who does one see as the major contradiction and who does one see as less so. Because I thought there was a very good sector in one of the pieces where you were doing the retrospective on 2020, where you begin to talk about we've got a racialized capitalist system, we've got different sectors with different strategies amongst the revanchist working class, the revanchist ruling class. So can you speak to that right quick, and then we'll be
quickly. See, there is a global authoritarian right that has been emerging. We see it in Russia. We see it in the United States. We see it in Argentina. We see it in Myanmar. We see it in a number of different places. And it has different forms. But what's clear is that these folks see commonality among them, and they wish to redivide the world. And in the process, they also want to suppress all progressive movements. That's our immediate threat. Now, as a socialist, I'm in opposition to capitalism. I'm in opposition to capitalists.
Right.
And ultimately want to replace the system of capitalism with a system of socialism towards a transition, towards ultimately a humane classes world. But there's a long way to get there. And in between, we have to figure out at each moment who is the particular enemy and who is most dangerous. And when I see what we see right now and have been seeing the last couple of weeks, but knew it after looking at Project 2025, you have to understand, if we do not defeat these people, they are seeking to annihilate us politically and annihilate many people physically. The aim of the right now is to annihilate LGBTQ people physically.
Yeah.
Their objective is also to suppress women,
Yeah.
to restructure gender roles. And I would argue, Sundiata, the creation of a neo-apartheid state.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. Yeah.
That's where it is. And that means they are willing to come to an accommodation with some people of color, like they're making alignments with the Hindu right,
Yeah.
as long as people swear ultimate allegiance to the white supremacist hegemony. That's why I take the stands that I do.
Bill, thank you. It's been a pleasure. I always find conversation with you to be deepens my thought and interest. So I appreciate you in that way and your leadership across various structures. So as of now, I'm going to
Thank you very much.
move us, and you take care, my brother.
You take care too.